men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan.
I should have got it going up there, you know. I really should have. There were so many acts of bravery there.
Like the rest of us, to stay there and fight to the finish.
G'day, it's David Howell here from Kokoda Historical, and welcome to the third instalment of my new podcast, Kokoda Kast. And it gives me great pleasure today from dreary old Melbourne in lockdown to introduce a good friend of mine and a Melbourne-based historian, Dr. Adrian Threlfal, the author of Jungle Warriors, From Tobruk to Kokoda and Beyond, How the Australian Army Became the World's Most Deadly Jungle Fighting Force. And today we're going to talk to Adrian about what sort of training and how Australians would have fared going into jungle warfare at the Kokoda campaign. So without further ado, welcome Adrian.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Now, Adrian, what I'm really looking at with my Kokoda Kast, and our last episode was about uniforms and equipment and how it changed within the campaign from going in with, say, khaki drill uniforms to ending up having dyed uniforms and jungle green uniforms, American gaiters, all this sort of stuff. And by no means was it as advanced as we got towards the end of the war. But what I'm looking at with you in this episode is the training, the doctrine that the Australian Army had, and how we would have fared with what knowledge we had going into this new theatre. So could you just give us a bit of a rundown, a bit of a background, in the build up to the Second World War, of how the Australian Army was prepared for a fighting in the jungle?
I think you would have to say that they were not well prepared at all. The only experience that Australian forces had had in the jungle would have been more than 20 years ago in the First World War, a very small action that I know you know a fair bit about, sometimes called the Battle of Biddapaka. So the AN and MEF forces seizing German wireless station in New Britain was the only previous experience the Australians had had in what we could call jungle terrain. So in the interwar years, so 1919 to 1939, no, there was very little training done at all anywhere in any jungle terrain. There's no understanding that we will have to fight in our region. Yes, there is a general fear of the Japanese, definitely. And this is one of the main reasons that we concentrate our efforts, I guess, on being a loyal part of the British Empire. That if we do this, as we had done in the First World War, we serve alongside British forces, whether in Europe or in the Middle East, that if we need it sometime in the future, Britain will come to our aid. And that's why we are probably even more fixated upon Singapore as this bastion to our north to protect us against any threat coming down from the north. In the past, maybe that fear was Chinese, but obviously in the years after 1922, when that Anglo-Japanese naval treaty comes to an end, we are fearful from then onwards that the only real threat in our region is posed by the Japanese. But in terms of preparing to serve in jungles, no, there is no idea that we will have to do that. All of our forward planning is about serving alongside British forces in Europe, basically the Western Front Part 2, or possibly to serve in the Middle East. So the deserts of North Africa, again, similar as the campaigns in 1916, 1917 and 1918 of the Light Horse. So no, there is no feeling that we would need to prepare to fight in the islands to our north.
So for the listeners that aren't aware of Australia's involvement in New Guinea in the First World War, we're talking about, of course, the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force. It was sent to Rabaul, which is the capital of East New Britain, and something that features in the history of the fighting in the Second World War, of course. But this is a time where it happened on the battle happened on the 11th of September 1914, so at the very early part of the First World War. And, this is our nearest neighbour, PNG. We obviously control Papua, but Germany controls German New Guinea. And so we send force up there, which comprised army and naval assets and sailors, to go out there. And they did. They had a fight along the Bitter-Parker Road to capture this wireless station. Of course, we get the first casualties, the first loss of life in the Great War, and first gallantry awards, first loss of a ship with the AE-1. We get all these things happening up there, but in a very short period of time, and then the First World War moves on, and of course we have Gallipoli and Western Front. But my question would be, I know that force stopped on its way to New Guinea to conduct some manoeuvres on Palm Island, and I know that they talk about how their uniforms and how they couldn't see the enemy if you read some of the accounts of what happens in that one day. But does the Australian military at all, or do the powers to be, record any of this experience to put into doctrine at any point? Because it really is our first experience as a nation in jungle warfare, albeit it's really a day, yeah?
No, it really, from what I have read and researched, no, there is very little that is learnt. Obviously, in the official histories, so that are recorded by several of the volumes by Bean, yes, it discusses what happens on that first day of the battle that you've just described, and then obviously the force remains there for the rest of the war, or a much smaller size force. Many of those men who serve in the AN and MEF come back to Australia. In fact, most of them do, and eventually most of them, or many of them, would serve on the Western Front or in the Middle East. But it appears that obviously reports are filed and filed away, but as to whether any of those move into doctrine at all, I can find no record that they did. Obviously, any of the lessons that were learnt in that, and it's only, as you said, it's only a one-day engagement, only really a few hours with a handful of casualties, and then it has no applicability to the fighting that takes place either at Gallipoli, all the battles throughout the Middle East, the campaign through Romania and Damascus. No relevance there, obviously, and no relevance on the Western Front. So there is no need for the rest of the First World War to pay any heed to any possible lessons that came out of that very brief engagement. The only lessons that appears as thought about are the medical side of things. There's quite a lot of because obviously the force that remains there throughout the next 3 years gets very sick. Everybody gets malaria. People get dysentery. People get scrub typhus.
People die.
Sorry?
People die.
People die. I think in the hundreds eventually die. And so there is medical reports about that, and about the inadequacy of malarial prophylaxis, I guess they would have called it, so protection against things like malaria, the diseases in the tropics. So that's probably where there is some writing, because they are there for so long, for several years, and have to deal with these tropical illnesses. But in terms of tactical and doctrinal improvements or developments or lessons, no, there appears to be virtually nothing at all. And if we jump forward to the Second World War, it appears that nobody is looking back at those records, as scant as they are, to prepare themselves for the Pacific War.
So the two things that I remember, and we'll move on from Rabaul in a moment, but the two clear things that I remember is, one, tropical force, a garrison force, and obviously the medical stuff that with malaria and living in tropical environment. But the other thing I do remember is, and for listeners who aren't familiar with Bitter-Parker, it basically was a road with jungle scrub on either side. And in the accounts, in the official history, it does recall from memory things that the soldiers couldn't see in front of them in the scrub, and they actually converge back onto the road because the amount of movement and it's just being impeded by the jungle, the visibility is low, and so they have to move back on the road, which, as we all know now, is probably the worst thing that you could do if you're trying to converge on an enemy. But surely, and it goes wrong in some parts, because we do get unexpected casualties. You also have as I said, the malarial stuff. So this has an impact. And if you go to Bitter-Parker Cemetery, people that I've taken there go and have a look at the graves, and how come these people are here? Are they in the battle? And I say, no, well, these are the garrison force, and they die of disease, and most likely they die of things like malaria or scrub typhus or something like that. So that has to have an impact, and it must, as you say, it must be recorded. So we kind of put that aside, and going into the Second World War, and this is where I'd like to get to now, we are first committed, of course, our first battle in Bardia. You know, we're committed to the Middle East. We've got weapon systems and we've got things that are pretty much left over from, or not left over, but rather a continuation, albeit with some modification from the First World War. But let's go now to Australia's first experience in the Second World War into jungle warfare. Where did that take place, and how did Australians fare, and what equipment did we have?
All right. Well, obviously the first combat doesn't occur until the Malayan campaign. The 8th Division is sent, I actually think when they're sailing away from Melbourne, many of them on the Queen Mary, beautiful liner, they think they're going to the Middle East. So secrecy has been very good, very successful. So this is February 1941. So this is only a few weeks after that first combat that the 6th Division had in the campaign that you just mentioned in North Africa. So the battles going through Bardia and then to Tobruk and Derna. So in January and February 1941. So in February 41, the first of the brigades of 8th Division sails for, well, as I said, they think they're joining their comrades. There's some fascinating photographs taken at the time of men hanging out the windows of train carriages in New South Wales. And they've graffitied all over it in chalk, written on the outside of the train carriages, "We're coming to get you, Muzzo," or "Berlin or bust." So they still think that they are going to join the 6th Division and the 7th Division because 9th hasn't been fully formed yet. They still think that they're going to the Middle East. The boats sail away from Fremantle, and instead of heading towards Ceylon and then over towards the Gulf, they turn north and they head towards Malaya. And eventually they get there. Obviously, it's only a couple of weeks. They get there and they begin training. And they prepare better than probably most British formations. There's only one other unit that's actually doing any jungle training. The 2nd Battalion of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders is actually going out into the jungles of Malaya and training. The rest of the British garrison in Singapore and the forces in Malaya, who are preparing for whatever eventuality, probably for the Japanese. Obviously, this is before that war. People are worried about the Japanese because they are obviously fighting a war in China, and they have been since 1937, or you could argue to some extent since 1931. So most of the British garrison is not worrying about jungle warfare. They are thinking about defeating an amphibious invasion and using those big guns at Singapore to defeat that landing, defeat a naval force. But the Australians do the right thing. They send out officers to go and talk to British units that have been stationed in Malaya for a number of years to find out what sort of preparations they are making, what sort of training they are doing. And very quickly they ascertain that it is only this one British unit, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, that actually goes out into the jungle and works out what works. How do you move through the jungle? How do you communicate? Do your radios work? How do you adjust fire for effect? Can you even use a 25-pounder? Can you use mortars? If you're using mortars under a tree canopy, surely the mortars will explode in that tree canopy above your head. So you have to go into a clearing before you can use your mortars. And there is a lot of, they are using the information that is gathered by this British battalion. And they are learning some lessons. They set up their own, they realise pretty soon that one of the first things that you need to change is your contact drills. You obviously, the distances that you're going to meet the enemy at are far, far closer. So it's obviously completely the opposite of Australian forces marching through the desert sands and attacking fortresses like Bardia or Tobruk. The problem there is obviously how do you get cover to get forward to those positions, because you're very open to being seen by the enemy all of the time. This is obviously the antithesis of that. So how do you move? How do you, as a commander and at any level, they quickly realise battalion commanders and brigade commanders get frustrated very quickly with their training exercises that they are doing because they can't see their men. They can't see their subunits. Battalion commanders can't see their companies, company commanders can't see their platoons, and even platoon commanders can't see their rifle sections. So at all levels, there's this worry that how can we actually fight in this terrain? And I think that's one of the reasons that most British units don't do it, because this doesn't require just a change of weapons or even tactics. This requires a change of thinking and a change of doctrine. But Malaya, I guess, is more complicated even than that. It's not just jungle. Anybody who's been there even recently knows that it has an excellent secondary road network. And this is obviously what the Japanese will advance along when the campaign happens, when it begins. And there's obviously telegraph poles along those roads, so you can communicate throughout the peninsula quite well in peacetime, and you can move along those roads very well in peacetime. But yes, as you were talking about Bitapaka, the understanding is the same. As soon as you get off those roads, you're lost. And so the British go the other way, except for, as I said, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. The British decide we just won't do it. We will fight on roads, which works if your enemy's also going to fight on those roads. But as we know, with the Malayan campaign, the Japanese, as soon as they are stopped, they move off the roads. And obviously they have the exceptional benefit of complete air superiority within a few days.
Adrian, I'll just interrupt you there for a second. From the Japanese perspective, because we're obviously getting to Kokoda and the enemy is the Japanese. The Japanese, as you say, aren't going to fight along the roads. And they'd been fighting prior to us joining into the war with them in the Pacific, but fighting in China. But what do they have when they're going into this in terms of doctrine? Do we know? Do they have at least an advantage over British Commonwealth forces in the jungle?
They have a number of advantages, but maybe not necessarily the advantages that we think of. I would have said one of the first advantages they have is their experience, so they're battle hardened. The vast majority of those forces that will fight once we get to the 7th of December 1941, some of those forces have been fighting in action in China for 4 years. So imagine that those forces that at D-Day, so 1944, those British forces, they've had 4 years of experience if you've been fighting since 1940. That's the first and greatest advantage that the Japanese have. The second advantage is not necessarily jungle training, but ferocious training that is at times exceptionally brutal. And in my research, I actually found out that a couple of British officers had been seconded to the Japanese army, one in the mid-1920s and one in the late 1930s, 37, 38. And these British officers had written reports, and they'd even appeared in the Army Journal, the Australian Army Journal. So this is published, it's the British Army Journal, but it's also published in Australia. And these articles mention many of the things that we know is true. One, the Japanese are ferociously disciplined, brutally disciplined. If you are a lieutenant, so the equivalent of a lieutenant, you can punch your sergeant in the face if he disobeys you or does something that you don't think is right. You can just punch him in the face. That sergeant will then do the same thing to his corporal, and that corporal will do the same thing to all his privates. So you are disciplined within an inch of your life to react instantly and to never ever show disobedience or fear in the face of what you are put into. You are trained brutally to the conditions. This British captain who served with them for 2 years in the late 1930s, he says that their final their passing out parade. You do 2 of them. You do one in the middle of winter and you wear your summer uniform. And the middle of winter in Japan is snow and ice. Men freeze to death. They don't just get hypothermia and lose fingers from frostbite. They freeze to death. And then you do the same thing in summer. But you make them wear their full winter uniform. So men die of heat stroke. It's utterly insane and it's utterly brutal, but it makes phenomenally tough soldiers. It makes for soldiers who will fight to the death, as we know the Japanese do throughout the Pacific War, until we get to the final battle at Okinawa. There's nearly 100,000 Japanese troops alive on Okinawa at the start of that campaign. Virtually every single one of them is dead at the end. They fight to the death. General Slim, the British commander, in his autobiography, talks about that. He says that all armies say that they will fight to their death and fight to the guns, fight their guns to the barrels. He said, but only one army did this, and that is the Japanese army. And he's right. So I think mostly it's their preparation. They do some jungle training on the island of what they call Formosa, so Taiwan. There is a jungle warfare training centre set up there in 1940 because the Japanese are preparing to fight southwards. They know that the Pacific War is coming. And they haven't really fought in the jungles. People think, that campaign in China is jungle warfare. It's not. They're not fighting down in southern China, sort of near the border with Vietnam, where there is actual jungle. So much of the combat that the Japanese forces are involved in is not quite European-style warfare, but it is certainly large units. It is all arms combined fighting. So they set up this jungle training centre on Formosa, and they put a lot of their units through there before the fighting begins in the South Pacific. So they are prepared to that extent.
And from the Australian, let's just stick back to the Australians now. From our perspective, okay, we don't have much in the way of training for jungle warfare, but we obviously know that if something happens to our immediate north, that we're going to have to be in a jungle environment. So is it because events are moving too fast, or is it because command doesn't see the value in it, because it's going to be a war where we protect ports and infrastructure and things like that? Or what is it? Why is there a reason that you think that if we know that it's most likely we're going to have to fight to our immediate north, that we don't put much energy and effort into training for that environment ourselves?
I think to an extent, there's two things that are happening. One, we believe the reassurances of the British government and the British military that both Hong Kong and Singapore are defendable and will be defended, and that if a threat really comes, Churchill says to Menzies that if Australia is threatened, if the Japanese do attack, we will send elements of the British fleet to Singapore, and they do that. They do carry out their promise eventually, and obviously the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, the brand new battle cruiser and the battleship and the old battle cruiser are sent out and are there. But as the British probably should have known, I guess with their battles earlier in both in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic, air power has tipped the balance. Obviously, the Bismarck is sunk in May 1941, and it is damaged obviously by Fairey Swordfish, some of the most obsolete torpedo bombers in the world, but they damaged the Bismarck enough to allow the British fleet to capture and sink her. Or the attacks, the night raid that Swordfish launch on Taranto, the Italian naval base, where they sink and damage quite a number of Italian battleships, battle cruisers and destroyers. So air power has already proved that it is more formidable than sea power. But the British don't provide enough aircraft and don't provide enough modern aircraft in the theatre, in Hong Kong or in Singapore. They just are not there. There's Brewster Buffaloes, there's some Lockheed Hudsons, there are no Spitfires and there are no Hurricanes. Even the few Dutch forces, the Dutch forces in the Dutch East Indies, obviously by the time the Pacific War breaks out, Holland has been captured, obviously been overrun by the Nazis, same as France. So the dregs of their colonial empires in French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, yes, there are military forces there, but they're weak and they are not being provided any support, obviously, from the European homelands because they're conquered by the Nazis. So I think the Australian government and then the Australian military are hoping that the Japanese won't attack. While nobody wants to be involved in a two-theatre war. It's exceptionally complex and very, very difficult. And Britain is fighting for its life. A lot of Australian historians have attacked the British for betraying us or letting us down. And on some levels, there's some truth in that, but we have to acknowledge that Britain has fought the Battle of Britain desperately. They're fighting, they're keeping most of their forces on the homeland, on the mainland of Great Britain, in case Operation Sea Lion is reborn, in case that Nazi invasion ever happens. Obviously, we know that once we get to Operation Barbarossa and the German invasion of Russia in June 1941, Hitler is not going to invade the UK, but you still need to have forces there to defend that mainland. And there's obviously many British divisions are fighting in the Middle East. So Australia hopes that there will be enough naval power in our immediate north, either at Hong Kong or at Singapore, to prevent or make the Japanese wary about launching an attack. And that obviously is proven to be false fairly soon, because Japanese air power is far too strong, and particularly their carrier forces are massively strong. Obviously, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and once you've sunk those British battleships and cruisers, the Air Force, the RAF in those regions to our north, is far too weak to provide air cover.
So back here then in Australia, just before Japan enters the war, as you're aware, Adrian, we decide to put a token, I guess, force sent to Papua where the Kokoda campaign is going to take place, and we form a brigade. We form an infantry brigade with a 30th Brigade, and from where we are here in Victoria, of course, you get the gallant 39th Battalion. You get, of course, their sister units in New South Wales, the 53rd Battalion, and of course the 49th from Queensland. So I just want to explore this a little bit going in prior to them arriving up there. Now, we all know that you hear the mythology around Australian soldiers in Kokoda, and they say, oh, they're all ill-trained and under-equipped, and they were just boys and all this sort of stuff. But I'm always quick to, and I'm interested in your opinion on this, that units like the 39th Battalion, yes, they were a militia battalion, but they went out to Darley in Bacchus Marsh here, just on the outside of Melbourne, and they did undergo training. And they were training next to members of AIF units, Australian Imperial Forces, that were also conducting training. And I always quick to say to people, well, were their experience not so much that they didn't have any training, rather that they were training for a different type of warfare? Because I guess in 1941, they were formed in October 1941, they would have been training off the doctrine that the Australian Army had for the theatre for the Middle East. And I just don't want to draw the lines too much here, because the 53rd, which we'll cover in this, has a very different experience. But for men of the 39th Militia Battalion, they're at Darley, they're in camp, they're doing training, and from what I've read, they are undergoing the similar sort of training as what AIF soldiers are going under. What's your thoughts on that?
Yep, I think that the militia units obviously are not as well equipped. Obviously, priority is given to the AIF units, and this is obviously still the 8th Division, or some units of the 8th Division, who really get sent up there in 3 different piecemeal moves. As I said, February 41, the first of the brigades of 8th Division gets sent to Singapore. It's not until August 41 that the second of those brigades is sent to Malaya, and their 3rd Brigade, as you would know, is split up and again, it eventually is defeated piecemeal, because they're sent to New Britain, to Timor, and to Ambon, the three battalions of that brigade, and eventually, obviously, are wiped out. But you're right, the training that's happening back here for militia units is the same, basically, that those AIF units are also doing. The problem is, as you hinted there, that training is completely and utterly inappropriate for what they will eventually do. That the 8th Division is no different. If you read the accounts in the war diaries of the 8th Division, particularly there's some fascinating accounts of those battalions, those New South Wales battalions that are they're training outside of Bathurst. And there's an account of them digging massive trench lines, extraordinary, several kilometres worth of trench lines, and advancing from those trench lines. They're fighting World War I all over again. And this is what many of the accusations are. And obviously, you are originally from New South Wales. You probably know that area around Bathurst. It's basically rolling farmland. Yes, there are some forested areas, but most of it is good farmland. So it is well cleared. There's nothing jungle-like about the country around that part of New South Wales. So there's none of the training that the 8th Division is doing before they leave Australia is appropriate for what they will eventually be involved in up in Malaya. And the same can be held. You're right. Darley is farmland on sort of the northwest or western outskirts of Melbourne, past Bacchus Marsh there. Again, inappropriate terrain for what they are going to be involved in. But their training is based upon the same training manuals that the RAF are using. So no, it's wrong to say that they were not trained. Where the problem is, I guess, yes, there's quite a lot of young and inexperienced ones. Yes, there's quite a lot of older ones as well who are either not fit or fairly quickly found to be unfit for the terrain that they're going into and the conditions. You've been to Papua New Guinea many more times than I have. That anybody who's even just been to, say, northern Queensland, the humidity, it's sapping. Imagine trying to march with a 30-kilogram pack on your back for 15, 20 kilometres and then to have to fight a battle. You have to be really, really fit and strong, and you really need to acclimatise. The first commando training happens down on Wilson's Promontory, which is bitterly cold in winter, and then they get sent up to Papua New Guinea. And yes, the terrain around Wilson's Promontory is very rugged. It's not jungle, but it is pretty thick forest, some of it. But it's bitterly cold for much of the year and windswept. So I guess it's inappropriate training locations. There is no understanding that we need to train in the terrain that we're going to fight in. And that means in Australia, you would have to fight in northern Queensland. Or you'd have to train in northern Queensland if you're going to have any sort of vaguely close approximation to what you're going to do. And when those militia units get sent to Port Moresby, as you have said, I would argue that they are treated very badly once they get there, for the majority of them.
Yeah, and we've got accounts of a couple of things going on. I did mention some of the other units, but in particular New South Welshmen, the 53rd Battalion. These are guys who, by all intents and purposes, are soldiers on paper, but they are Shanghai. They're the guys who live up to that reputation. And we hinted about being in the tropics. And as you'd be aware, Adrian, the 30th Brigade goes through some big changes as Japan's entering the war. And a lot of their officers and senior NCOs, some men, in particular with the 39th, are veterans of the First World War. They are, including their Conran, their commanding officer, are sent home because they are deemed not fit for tropical service. And they get replacements, and in particular, the 39th get a lot of senior NCOs on promotion. And the 39th Battalion, for example, the 1st Rifle Company of that unit that goes to meet the Japanese, they've got their 2 IC and 2 of their platoon commanders have just seen service in the Middle East, but again, not in the jungle theatre. So I want to come now to fast forward a little bit, and Japan has invaded mainland Papua for the kickoff of the Kokoda campaign at Basaboa there on the 21 July 42, and the 39th are going to, along with the PIB, are going to meet them. But in this change of officers and coming in to relieve those who are not fit for tropical service, you get their new CO, a man, William Owen, who has escaped from Rabaul and knows exactly about these things you're talking about. He knows exactly, although that's a battle that only really goes for a day for the Australians, but this is going up against ferocious enemy who we've already covered in terms of how they are faring in battle, the soldiers and the discipline they had. But he is well aware of the brutality of the Japanese, but also well aware of what it's like to just be in a jungle environment. Here's guys who have gone off every man for themselves, trudging through the jungle trying to escape. So they can't be under any illusion of what fighting in the jungles or going up against the Japanese are. So let us now sort of cover this period with the early battles of Kokoda, the Kokoda 1, Kokoda 2, Deniki and Isarava, this area that was fighting primarily by militiamen with some experienced AIF officers going up against this formidable enemy. How did their training, their doctrine fare in those early parts of the campaign?
Well, I think of the 3 militia battalions that you have mentioned, the 39th are probably the most well-trained, and they're probably luckier that they have done some patrolling up and around along what most people know as the Kokoda track. They had the opportunity to see what this terrain was like. I've read patrol reports of the 39th Battalion in June and July, so just leading up to the engagements you're talking about, where they have sent patrols out in different directions. So they have had some men who've got some experience of moving through this terrain. They are becoming acclimatized, but Doctrine still isn't changing. So the different action drills that you have to use that are very different. The patrol formations are very different. In the desert, you have an arrowhead formation. So you have one up and two back, whether that is talking about rifle sections or whether that's talking about platoons, because it just makes sense. But you have to change things. You change the sort of formations and patrols that you use. And you also have to use, today people would say snap shooting, or even shooting from the hip, or having ranges that you have your soldiers move through and fire at really close ranges. So the practice that's still happening with your standard 303 short magazine Lee Enfield is still firing at distances between 100 and 400 yards is standard. That is fine, again, for fighting in Europe or possibly even for fighting in the deserts, but it's completely and utterly pointless in most of the terrain around Kokoda or along that track. You need to be shooting at distances, firing at distances under 20 metres. I mean, you know that terrain far better than I do. At times, you can't see people until they're under 20 metres away. At times, if you go off the tracks, it may only be 5 metres. So you need to be able to be having people react far more quickly, and you also need to provide the firearms that can enable you to do that. And one of my disappointments, I guess, with the preparation eventually in this period here, 1942, middle of 1942 for the 39th Battalion, but even more so for the 7th Division battalions that will arrive, the 2nd 14th, 2nd 16th and 2nd 27th. Both the 8th Division training in Malaya, so from February 41 onwards, and then in this period from March to June 1942, two of the 6th Division's brigades were withdrawn and stopped in Ceylon for 6 months, or 4.5 months. Both times they obviously did a lot of training, and they wrote an awful lot of reports. And many of these reports talk about the need for training in close quarters combat, for what they called snap shooting, and also to increase the number of submachine guns was one of the best things that they said straight away is we need to do. A 303 is a fantastic rifle. They're still very accurate today. You've got one from the First World War, even though it's 100 years old now, you should still be able to hit a target 500 metres away if you're a good enough rifle shot. But these reports, as I said, more than a year before the fighting on the track, they're saying we need camouflage uniforms and we need submachine guns. We need a higher preponderance of automatic weapons is one of the lines that I can recall from one of the reports. And as I said, both 8th Division training and both 6th Division training claim we need this. And that needs to happen, and it doesn't. There is no change to what's called the war establishment of any of these formations when they move up to Papua New Guinea. Some of them have only really recently been issued with their Bren guns. They haven't had their Bren guns for very long. They don't take up things like their Vickers. People feel that the Vickers needs to have clear lines of sight. You need to be able to adjust fall of shot. I mean, you can kill someone with a Vickers machine gun on a tripod 2 kilometres away, 3 kilometres away if you're good enough. But the Japanese have a very different attitude to automatic weapons. They understand that automatic weapons, yes, on the one hand, they're excellent for providing fire at long distances, but they also put out a massive volume of fire. So if you use an automatic weapon at 20 metres range, you cut down the jungle and you cut down the people in that jungle. Even if you can't see them, it's irrelevant. If you put down a weight of fire, you put people to ground. You either kill them, you wound them, or you terrify them. So a Vickers set up on a tripod on the track, firing along that track, even though they could only see 20 metres away, would have slaughtered the Japanese. But they don't take Vickers because you can't adjust the fall. The doctrine of the time says you need to be able to adjust the fall of shot onto the target. So that it's pointless having those sort of medium or heavy machine guns. And similarly with mortars. they don't take their 3-inch mortars. They take a reduced number of 2-inch mortars. Those first units, the 39th Battalion and even the 2nd 14th, the Victorian Battalion who follows them, don't take their 3-inch mortars. The New Guinea Force commander, the general in charge of New Guinea Force, talks to a young lieutenant of the 39th. He's a mortar platoon commander. And this New Guinea Force commander, this general, says, "Ross, bloody Ross boy, you can't use mortars in the jungle. The bombs will explode in the trees." And so they don't take their mortars, whereas the Japanese do. The Japanese say, yes, we don't adjust the weapons that we take to the terrain. Maybe we have to adjust how we use those weapons, but we take the full complement of weapons that we are given because we need them in order to be successful. Whereas the Australians kind of overreact to the terrain they're going into, and so they reduce their scales. They have hand grenades, they have 303s, and they have not enough Bren guns. So there's no surprise to me that they are pushed back, and obviously they are massively outnumbered as well. But yeah, their doctrine is inappropriate for the terrain that they are going into, because it is based on pre-war doctrine and also the doctrine that has been developing in the Middle East over the last 2 years. So it's not that they are untrained, although they're not as well trained, obviously, as the 2nd AIF, but they are not prepared and not properly trained for the terrain that they're going into.
We move on to, obviously, the Australians, the militia, and I should mention the PIB contact the Japanese at the start of the Kokoda campaign, and they then begin this fighting withdrawal, and they start to move up. And trekkers, previous trekkers are listening to this would know the villages of Kokoda and Daniki and up to Isarava. And as we said in the last podcast, you get this scenario where the militia forces are dug in at Isarava, waiting for one of two things to happen: either for the Japanese to roll over the top of them, or of course for the AIF guys, the men of the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th who are marching towards them from the Port Moresby end. Now, it seems apparent to me while we're talking here is that the biggest fallback with the doctrine that we're working towards is that, and you mentioned it before, is that in the jungle you can't have these big full frontal engagements where you have all your, at a brigade level or even at a battalion level or even at a company level. It's really fought. And a lot of the veterans I've spoken to, it's really a personal war in the sense that it's personal, not in the sense that you can see your enemy, because there's lots of accounts where things happen and you don't even know what's going on. You can't see the person, but it's personal in the sense that it's small groups or collections of men in either sections or even below half a section or something that comes across, and they have these engagements at this smaller level. So I guess here they are, the commanders are training to be able to maneuver all their force, but it's not. It's got to be concentrated down on a smaller level. And in order to be able for them to succeed in doing what it is that they've got to do as riflemen, they're not equipped with the right weapon systems. You mentioned the 303 rifle. It's a big, long, heavy rifle to bear in the jungle with someone that's only a few feet in front of you that you can't see. Automatic weapons are in short supply, and we know that independent companies later on change the way they maneuver, and they have lots of top heavy with automatic weapons in their section and their formations. But so how does this come into play? Like right now it's October 2020, and we're in the anniversary months of the ladder fighting, with the Australians pushing the Japanese back, and they come to the biggest fighting in the Owen Stanley, which of course is the Eora Creek engagements. And comes to mind the 16th Brigade Commander Brigadier Lloyd, who is still trying to do full frontal attacks up very steep slopes across a major water feature being Eora Creek, with the Japanese dug in with this blocking action. And listeners would have known just before this podcast comes to air is that we went through the Manusu story of the brothers that die on the other side of Eora Creek. So what is been going through the minds of brigade commanders or even company commanders or battalion commanders that are there? They're alongside their men fighting in the jungle, but they don't seem to be fluid. They don't seem to be adapting to their conditions, even though they've been several weeks. They've already come in there. They're already with the 7th Division guys battle hard, and they've seen fighting. How come they cannot adapt as fluidly as what the men, I guess, would have hoped to have done?
Yeah, and I think it's training. It's training and experience. Many of the, certainly division level, but also brigade level commanders of the AIF or the militia had served pre-war, and many of them had experience in the First World War. And they're used to being able to command and control, as you would be aware. Command, control, and communications are the three things that are the hardest to do in the jungle. As you said then, you can't see your men. Certainly a battalion commander cannot see where his companies are. A company commander generally can't see where his platoons are, of 40 men, say, and even the platoon commander can't see where his sections of 11 or 12 men are. So what this means is that you have to have all of your men have to be exceptionally well trained in their own individual skills. So need to know how to fire their rifle, need to know how to march, need to know how to maneuver in the jungle. And they haven't had that training in the jungle. Yes, they may, and obviously you're talking about the Aurora Creek, so battalions like the 2nd, 3rd, New South Wales battalions are very well experienced. They have fought. They fought in the Middle East. They fought at Bardia, Tobruk. They fought in Greece. Some of them came back through the Cretan campaign. So many of these men have had combat experience and have been training for a couple of years. But they're used to serving and following doctrine and training that is appropriate, as I said, for different conditions. And very quickly, people realise that this war is, I think you might have mentioned it, or I did, it's a section commander's war. It is, and that means you've got to trust your corporals. And it's very frustrating, I think, for many of these commanders at all those levels that you've described and I've described, to not be able to see the battle unfolding, and they feel that they can't influence the battle. So something like Aurora Creek, Lloyd, does completely the wrong thing, and his company commanders, and probably the battalion commanders as well, but I've read a couple of accounts of company commanders with grave reservations. They do not want to launch the attack that Lloyd is ordering them to do. They know how it's going to end. They know that they will eventually be successful, but they know that they will take unacceptable levels of casualties in doing that. And I think those higher-level commanders are having great difficulty adjusting to the different terrain that they are faced with, and really not able to devolve responsibility down to the level of section commanders. Because as I said, it's not even just a platoon lieutenant or a platoon sergeant that has command, because they have to maybe give their orders, but then they can only really influence themselves and maybe for a young lieutenant his batman, or a captain his batman. That's about all you can fight with. So that's the problem that many of these Australians are having, that it's not just a subunit action, as you said, it's almost an individual action. You as a soldier at times don't even see who shot you, and plenty of the 39th Battalion men earlier in the campaign, sort of July and August, mentioned, I didn't even see that Jap bastard, the one who shot me, because a rifle shot rings out or a hand grenade explodes out of the green wall in front of you. And so each of these units, these Australian units that's coming through, so whether it's the 39th Battalion, so the militia units that hit the Japanese first, whether it's 21 Brigade of the 7th Division that hits them second, who fights at Isarava, so August 42, or 25 Brigade from 7th Division, or you've just mentioned the 16th Brigade also from 6th Division, they're all having to pick up whatever they can very quickly from those units that have come before them, and things that are changing really, really quickly as they're going. As they meet people coming back off the track, they are told, right, we should have had Vickers guns. So someone says, oh, all right, we'll take a few Vickers guns. They talk to someone else and they say, you're going to need mortars, and they go, oh, all right, we'll take a few mortars. So there's constant fluid changing of what weapons we're going to take and the number of weapons we're going to take. So they're trying to adapt really quickly to this new terrain, and also this enemy who doesn't fight like any enemy that they have fought before. So there's a number of problems, but I think it's the inability to devolve responsibility down to the lowest level. They're happy to maybe give command to officers, to captain, to majors, captains, to lieutenants, but when it's actually section commanders and below that need that responsibility, they're reluctant to do that, and they can't communicate. the 108 sets don't work. The rain gets into them. You've got massively high mountains, so radio waves don't get through. The humidity kills radio sets straight away. Even communications on bits of paper. How can you write a message on a bit of paper when you've got torrential rain? It turns your paper to mush straight away. So you need to then messengers. You have to have runners. You have to have blokes running, and they just disappear. I mean, you know the Battle of Isarabo better than I do. There's many occasions when people are sent to take messages out to somebody, an isolated platoon 50 metres away, and they never get there. They disappear. They obviously bumped into a Japanese platoon or even just a Japanese soldier. They fell down a hole. They fell down a cliff. They got bayoneted. Who knows? So people just disappear into the jungle. So you can't communicate. So I think that increases the frustration of these commanders. They can't communicate with their subunits. And so they're not getting any messages back. So yeah, communication, control, and command turn to chaos.
I'll just bring you back for a second there, Adrian, because in our last episode we had Gary Trainer, who's well versed in the Australian uniforms and webbing and equipment and stuff, and we mentioned in the last podcast about and we gave an account actually of 25th Brigade members of the 2nd 33rd who get up to Sageri, Koitaki Way, just before they're about to set foot on Kokoda track, and they are literally taking off their khaki uniforms, and there's actually soya stoves, and they've got dye in them, and they're dyeing their uniforms. They're getting issue of American gaiters, which were all these things that we covered. But I find it really crazy when you think that there was, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there was this sentiment from a higher that you know, having things in a different colour, like a uniform being green as opposed to a khaki, which is almost bleached white when they've been worn for a long period of time. So what do we know about this? What was the Army's doctrine on uniforms around the time of the Kokoda campaign?
They do say the fish rots from the head, and this is Blamey's fault. It's as simple as that. I mean, I know there's a lot of Blamey bashers out there, and for a number of reasons, and he has a number of supporters also who are possibly equally as vehement. There is a press conference in early September 1942, and Chester Wilmot is one of those reporters, a famous Australian journalist. I think Damien Pera might have been there as well. And Wilmot asks this exact question, because Wilmot and Pera had actually, Pera in particular, had been and stayed and spent time with Kanga Force in Wow. So you know, the fighting up in the hills there, up in the highlands. And the Australians up in Kanga Force had dyed their uniforms a darker colour. They used coffee grounds. So the leftover coffee grounds, they put in a big urn and stirred the uniforms around to make them a darker colour. And Wilmot had posed this question to Blamey at this press conference down in Port Moresby, and said, why don't the Australians have camouflage uniforms? And Blamey, who disliked Wilmot anyway, had replied and said that khaki had been invented by the British Army for use in what he called the jungles of India, and he had no intelligence or no information that the jungles of Papua New Guinea were any different than the jungles of India that the British Army had to fight in prior to the Second World War, and therefore he did not see any need for a different coloured uniform than the uniform that was issued to the Australian Army. End of conversation.
Wow. So it's a real shutdown, and so no wonder you get units or subunits that take it upon themselves to try and get their uniform and equipment in line with the conditions that they're in. I think it would be negligent of us not to revisit what we said earlier on about anti-malarial and dealing with it, because of course we're not just talking about the enemy, we're not just talking about the uniforms and equipment. Men in the Kokoda campaign are going down, and there's a huge attrition rate when it comes to disease and in the jungle. And not just, you mentioned radio sets, but imagine if you get a slight wound that's aggravated by the jungle, and then you've got dysentery, you've got malaria, you've got all of these things. I'd like to explore now, if we can. Obviously, this information's coming back. You've got casualties coming back. You've got men that need to be treated, you know, field hospitals, and then Australian General Hospitals being set up back in Moresby. What happens with the doctrine or with the writings within the organisation of the Australian Army? Are we paying attention to what's going on there? Are we trying to do something to resolve these issues?
It's hard to change things in the middle of the campaign. It is really not until after February 1943, so after the beachhead campaigns of Buna, Gona and Sanananda are finished, when the army can take a breath, take a pause, and say, all right, now let's have a look at all of these reports. And yes, of course, there's lots of after-action reports being written. If you read the unit war diaries, obviously all the battalions are keeping their war diaries. Yes, they are not as well kept when the units are in battle. So obviously the 39th War Diary becomes a bit minimalist in July and August. And 21 Brigade, theirs is not as good. A lot of it is written up after the battle, so after August and September when they've returned. So lessons are being learnt on the ground and passed back immediately along the track, but not as many of them are getting back to Port Moresby, and then not as many of them are getting back to the Directorate of Military Training, so the DMT, back in Melbourne at the barracks, in Victoria Barracks on St Kilda Road. Eventually they do get back there, but while the battle is happening, so really from July 42 through till February 43, I know that's quite a long period of time, the lessons are getting to the units when they arrive. Fascinatingly, I read a story of, again, a New South Wales unit, so 16 Brigade. He'd got, this young man, he was only a private, he'd gone to the movies back in Sydney before 16 Brigade got sent up to Port Moresby, and he'd seen Damien Pereira's Kokoda Frontline. So he'd seen that documentary before the movie that he was there to watch. He watched that. What did he go and do? He went out to a dressmaker's shop and he and his mates bought up tins of dye. They bought up dark green tins of dye and they took it back to their unit and they dyed their uniforms. So this is an extraordinary way for a lesson to get passed back through things. And I only learned this because I just read this young man's account. And so it wasn't a unit thing. They said, this is a private. This isn't even a corporal or a lance corporal. This is a private. But he's watching Damien Pereira's documentary, filmed, obviously part of it at Kanga Force, but part of it on the track in July and August. And he's gone, all right, maybe we need to do something. And Pereira mentions that. As I said, all these Australian journalists can see it, that we need to do things differently. And so, yeah, he takes up a tub of dye. But as you said, many of those other units, even the 25th Brigade, are still changing things as they go. Some units have none of those American gaiters that you're talking about, the long gaiters. One battalion goes up and they've got half of their men have gaiters. Another unit goes up and all of their men have those gaiters. So it's really the system is trying to catch up with the change, and it can't do it fast enough. I know of one battalion before they were deployed to Papua New Guinea. They were training next to an artillery regiment, field artillery regiment, 25 pounders back in Australia. The battalion commander went and had drinks with the field battery commander, and over a bottle of gin, they agreed to swap 42 303s for 42 Thompson submachine guns, because the battalion commander said, I'm getting these reports back from my fellow commanders up on the track that we need more automatic weapons. I can't get the Australian Army to provide me with more automatic weapons. Your field artillery regiment has been provided with submachine guns, Thompson submachine guns, to defend their gun pits. Obviously, for the worst case scenario for an artillery regiment is you have to obviously fight and defend your own guns. You should, in theory, have an infantry unit protecting your gun positions, but at times that doesn't happen. So this field artillery regiment had been equipped with Thompson submachine guns to defend itself at the guns. These two men had a gentleman's agreement and they swapped. And that helped. And that meant that this infantry battalion commander could provide Thompson submachine guns to his lead sections of each of his companies. They didn't have enough automatic weapons that they wanted, but it was still a godsend. And this field artillery regiment wasn't being deployed to New Guinea anytime soon. So that's why this commander was willing to swap 42 303s, because on his war establishment, it still would have said that he had 42 firearms or the equal number of firearms. So this is the sort of stuff that's happening on the ground in Australia, or even after they arrive in Papua New Guinea. So there's a lot of, and so this is happening below brigade level. It's happening at either battalion level or below battalion level. So as I said, it's really not until after February 43 that the Army starts to catch up with the reports that are being written and the lessons that are being learned on the ground by those men. And then people like Brigadier Lloyd or Potts can finally look at what's happening and start to think, these are the lessons that we need to have before we fight the next jungle campaigns.
Well, it is a fascinating subject, and I really thank you, Adrian, for giving an insight into, I guess, the lack of preparedness that Australian soldiers had going up into the Kokoda campaign. And the message that I've taken away from our conversation today is really backing up that, that great Australian character, if you will, that, if we can't, we're going to take matters into our own hand. And the story of the the story of unit commanders swapping rifles for automatic weapons, and then I think it's fantastic. And I guess it is a credit to the individual soldiers, and that to think about what they would need before going into it. And it's a real credit to the spirit, I guess, of the Australian soldier. Look, thanks a lot, Adrian. Really appreciate your talk today with us, and hopefully we'll have you back in a later episode where we could talk further about how this lessons learnt from Kokoda is adapted to be used in the latter campaigns in New Guinea. We'll close by saying your book, excellent book, Jungle Warriors. Can listeners still get your book, and where can they get it?
It's a few years old now, working on the second and the third books in that trilogy, bringing the story up into the Cold War into later years. You can get it online, so you can get it at any of those online booksellers. So I know I've seen it for Amazon. It's relatively cheap now, several years after it was first published. If we didn't have lockdown, I could say you could come and visit and buy them from me, because I have a few copies, and I actually get a bit more money if I sell it personally. But no, you can certainly get it for places like Book Depository. I think even Readings sell them. They can get them in Allen and Unwin, Amazon, any of online book dealers can still obtain copies of it.
Well, thanks again, Adrian. And for those listeners at home, if you want a copy of Jungle Warriors, visit kokodahistorical.com.au. We can get you in touch with Adrian. And until next time, thanks, and we salute you.
Thank you, David.